I'm Rebecca Miller, 34, and I never imagined I'd be sitting in a courtroom while my millionaire husband of 6 years tried to humiliate me in front of everyone. Your Honor, my wife is sterile. She knew this before our marriage and deliberately deceived me, James declared confidently, his expensive lawyer nodding beside him. I felt the room spinning as gasps echoed around me. 6 years of marriage, 3 miscarriages I'd suffered alone while he was working, and now this public betrayal. But then the judge picked up the sealed envelope I'd provided and broke the silence. Mr. Miller, would you care to explain these paternity test results? If you're shocked by what my husband did, wait until you hear the whole story. I still can't believe how someone I trusted completely could betray me this way. Before I continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. The support from all of you has helped me find the strength to share this difficult journey. If my story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about family betrayal and finding justice when you least expect it. Before I met James, I was just Rebecca Thompson, a dedicated nurse at Memorial Hospital, working in the maternity ward. The irony isn't lost on me now. I loved helping new mothers and their babies, dreaming that someday I'd have my own family. I wasn't wealthy by any means, but I was comfortable in my modest 2-bedroom apartment and enjoyed my simple life with friends and colleagues. James Miller walked into my life one rainy Tuesday when he was visiting his grandmother at the hospital. He was undeniably handsome at 39, with salt and pepper hair that made him look distinguished rather than old, piercing blue eyes, and a smile that lit up the room. As CEO of Miller Tech Solutions, his net worth was estimated at around $40 million, though I didn't know that when we first met. He asked for my number after I helped his grandmother through a particularly rough night, claiming he wanted to thank me properly. Our first date was at an upscale restaurant I could never have afforded on my salary. James was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in my life and work. Looking back, I should have noticed how he dominated the conversation, interrupting whenever I spoke about my friends or family. But I was swept off my feet by the flowers delivered to my apartment, surprise weekend getaways to coastal resorts, and the way he looked at me like I was the only woman in the world. There were red flags, of course. James would get irritated if I spent time with my friends without him. He suggested I cut back my hours at the hospital because he could take care of me now. He questioned my clothing choices and gradually replaced my wardrobe with designer items he selected. At the time, I interpreted all of this as care and attention rather than the control it actually was. Our wedding was an extravagant affair at his family's estate. 300 guests, many of whom I'd never met, watched as I walked down the aisle in a custom-designed gown that cost more than my yearly salary. James's vows brought tears to my eyes. I promised to love you forever, to give you the family you deserve, and to cherish every moment of our life together. If only I had known those words were as empty as his heart would prove to be. The first 2 years of our marriage were relatively happy. We moved into a sprawling mansion in the most exclusive neighborhood in town, complete with a pool, home theater, and 6 bedrooms I hoped we would eventually fill with children. James was often busy with work, but he'd surprise me with gifts and weekend trips that kept the romance alive. As I approached 30, I brought up the subject of starting a family. James seemed enthusiastic, even suggesting we convert one of the spare rooms into a nursery. The Miller legacy needs to continue, he'd say with pride. We started trying right away, and I was delighted when I discovered I was pregnant just 3 months later. The joy was short-lived. At 8 weeks, I began spotting and rushed to the hospital. James was away on a business trip and didn't answer my calls. By the time he returned 2 days later, I had already gone through the miscarriage alone. His reaction was puzzling. Instead of comforting me, he seemed almost relieved. He patted my hand awkwardly and said, "We can try again when you're stronger," before immersing himself in work calls. I chalked it up to men handling grief differently and focused on recovering. 6 months later, we were trying again, and I became pregnant for the second time. This time, James was home when the cramping started, but he simply called his driver to take me to the hospital while he attended an important board meeting. I lost that baby at 10 weeks. The third miscarriage happened a year later, and by then, James had become increasingly distant. He was traveling more, coming home late, smelling of unfamiliar perfume, and growing critical of everything I did. Our once passionate marriage had cooled to polite interactions and separate bedrooms. When I lost the third baby, James didn't even come to the hospital. He sent flowers with a card signed by his assistant. Around this time, I began noticing strange text messages on his phone when he left it unattended. Messages from someone named M that were clearly not professional, references to meetings in hotels, and reminders to delete their conversation history. When I accidentally picked up his phone one night, thinking it was mine, I saw a message preview from M that read, "Last night was amazing. When can you get away from her again?" My heart shattered, but I needed concrete proof before confronting him. I began paying attention to his schedule, noting the discrepancies between what he told me and where he actually was. One evening, when he claimed to be at a business dinner, I drove past the restaurant he'd mentioned and didn't see his car. Acting on intuition, I checked the boutique hotel downtown, and there it was, his distinctive black Bentley, parked in the reserved section. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. The next morning, I confronted James with what I knew. He denied everything vehemently, calling me paranoid and unstable. "This is why we can't have a baby," he shouted during our argument. "You're too emotional and irrational." His words cut deep, especially since I was still grieving our lost pregnancies. A week later, I discovered who M was. Megan Thomas, his 6-year-old executive assistant, who looked eerily similar to me when I was younger. When I showed James the photos I'd taken of them together, he didn't even try to deny it anymore. Instead, he laughed and said, "At least she doesn't have fertility issues." The next day, I received divorce papers. The grounds? Fraudulent misrepresentation. James claimed I had deceived him about being able to have children before our marriage. According to his filing, I was sterile and had known it all along, deliberately trapping him in a childless marriage to access his fortune. I was blindsided. Not only was this completely false, but I had the medical records from my miscarriages to prove it. What I didn't have was money for a legal battle against a man who could buy the entire law firm if he wanted to. That's when I learned about the true extent of the Miller family's power. They didn't just own Miller Tech Solutions. They controlled half the businesses in our city, had judges and politicians in their pocket, and were notorious for crushing anyone who stood against them. James's father, Richard Miller, had built an empire through ruthless tactics and passed that mentality on to his son. His mother, Catherine, was equally formidable. A steel magnolia who maintained a perfect public image while orchestrating the family's social and political connections. As I packed my belongings, wondering how I would fight against such overwhelming odds, I found a folder James had accidentally left in our shared home office. Inside were financial documents that made no sense to me at the time, but instinct told me to take them. Little did I know, they would become the first thread that would unravel the entire Miller family tapestry of lies. With limited savings from before my marriage, I found a small apartment on the other side of town and began researching divorce attorneys. Most refused to take my case once they heard I was going up against James Miller. Some were honest enough to admit they couldn't risk antagonizing the Miller family. Others simply quoted retainer fees so astronomical I knew they were trying to deter me. Finally, I found Laura Adams, a scrappy divorce attorney who operated out of a converted house rather than a sleek downtown office. She had a reputation for taking on underdogs and a personal grudge against wealthy men who discarded their wives. When I told her my story, she didn't promise miracles, but she did promise to fight. "The Millers will throw everything at us," Laura warned during our first meeting. "They'll hire investigators to dig into your past. They'll try to paint you as unstable or gold digging, and they'll use their connections to delay proceedings until you run out of money. Are you prepared for that?" I wasn't sure I was, but what choice did I have? The alternative was accepting James's narrative and walking away with nothing after 6 years of emotional abuse and manipulation. The day after I hired Laura, I returned to the mansion to collect the rest of my belongings, only to find the locks changed and a security guard posted at the gate. "Mr. Miller has instructed that you're not permitted on the property, he informed me, without meeting my eyes. Any items you need will be shipped to your new address after they've been inventoried. I sat in my car, trying not to cry, when my phone pinged with a text from an unknown number. Meet me at Riverside Park, bench near the fountain, 3 p.m. Information about James you need to know. Against Laura's advice, I went. The woman waiting for me introduced herself as Sophia Williams. It took me a moment to place her, but then I remembered seeing her photo in old news articles about James. They had dated for nearly 5 years before our relationship. Let me guess, she said, studying my face. 3 miscarriages? All when you were about 2 months along? And now he's calling you sterile? My blood ran cold. How did you know that? Because the same thing happened to me. And to Caroline before me. Sophia explained that James had a pattern. He would find women who desperately wanted children, marry them, and then when they inevitably had miscarriages, he would blame them and move on. It's some kind of sick game to him and his mother. Catherine is obsessed with the perfect Miller heir. Sophia couldn't offer concrete evidence, but she pointed me toward places to look and people to contact. Most importantly, she warned me about the lengths the Millers would go to protect their reputation. Armed with this information, I began systematically investigating James's past relationships and financial dealings. Laura helped me file for emergency access to our joint accounts, which James had already emptied, but the judge granted me a small monthly stipend for living expenses until the divorce was finalized. The financial documents I'd taken from the house included references to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands that wasn't listed in our marital assets. Laura hired a financial forensic expert who confirmed James had been moving significant sums of money into this account throughout our marriage, potentially hiding assets in preparation for our divorce. One evening, desperate for more information, I drove to James's office building after hours. Using the employee badge I still had from the company Christmas party, I managed to access the parking garage. I wasn't planning to enter the building, just hoping to perhaps glimpse something through windows or catch James in a compromising situation. What I saw exceeded my wildest suspicions. James emerged from the building with a woman who wasn't Megan. This woman was visibly pregnant, maybe 6 months along. They walked to his car together, James's hand protectively on her lower back, in a gesture that was painfully familiar. Before they drove away, he kissed her tenderly, his hand resting on her pregnant belly. I followed them at a safe distance to a private medical facility on the outskirts of town, the Westfield Clinic. I couldn't enter without being seen, but I parked nearby and watched them go inside. An hour later, they emerged. The woman clutching a folder of what looked like medical documents, while James spoke intensely on his phone. I caught fragments of his conversation as they passed near my car. This one working out better than the last. Mother is pleased with the progress. Genetic screening came back perfect. A chill ran down my spine. What exactly was going on? The next day, I contacted Maria, our former housekeeper who had always been kind to me. She'd been fired shortly after I moved out, allegedly for stealing, though I never believed that. Maria was hesitant to meet, clearly afraid of the Millers, but eventually agreed to coffee at a diner far from the city center. Mrs. Catherine is very particular about the family bloodline, Maria told me in a hushed voice. I overheard many conversations between her and Mr. James about finding the right genetic match. She rejected many of his girlfriends before you because they didn't meet her standards. Standards? I asked, confused. Genetic standards. Mrs. Catherine has theories about superior genes and bloodlines. She believes the Miller family has special genetic qualities that must be preserved. She was very excited when you got pregnant the first time, but then became angry after each miscarriage, blaming you. Maria also revealed that Catherine had a secret room in the family estate filled with genealogy charts and medical records of potential matches for her son. She's been planning the next generation of Millers, like their racehorses, Maria said, clearly disturbed. This information led me to dig deeper into the Miller family history. Laura discovered that James's father had included a stipulation in his will. If James didn't produce a legitimate heir by his 40th birthday, his substantial personal inheritance would go to his cousins instead. With James turning 40 inches less than a year, the pressure to have a child would be intense. The most shocking discovery came when I managed to access my complete medical records from the fertility specialist we had consulted after my second miscarriage. Dr. Franklin had always seemed caring and professional, but something about his connection to the Miller family had nagged at me. When I requested my records in person, the receptionist stepped away to make a call. I took the opportunity to peek at her computer screen, which showed my file was flagged with special instructions. Miller, Rebecca, Protocol 7, authorize all medication changes per J.M. without patient consultation. Dr. Franklin was surprised when I confronted him with this information, but after some pressure, he reluctantly admitted that James had requested certain adjustments to my treatment. He wouldn't specify what those adjustments were, claiming doctor-patient confidentiality, but his discomfort was telling. I can tell you that Mr. Miller requested copies of all your test results and scans, including those showing you have a completely normal reproductive system, Dr. Franklin finally admitted. There is absolutely no medical reason you couldn't carry a pregnancy to term under normal circumstances. This was the moment everything clicked. James knew I wasn't sterile. He had evidence proving I was perfectly capable of having children. Yet he was building a legal case claiming otherwise. Why? The answer came when Laura's investigator found evidence that James had been diagnosed with fertility issues of his own years ago. A disgruntled former employee of the Westfield Clinic provided records showing James had a low sperm count and motility problems that made it difficult, though not impossible, for him to father children naturally. I broke down crying when I saw those records. All this time, I had blamed myself for our inability to have children. I had carried the grief of 3 lost pregnancies alone, believing something was wrong with my body. Meanwhile, James had known the truth and deliberately let me suffer. As devastating as this revelation was, it gave me renewed determination. James wasn't just divorcing me under false pretenses. He had actively deceived me throughout our entire marriage. With Laura's help, I began building a case that would expose not just his lies, but the entire Miller family's manipulations. After discovering James's fertility issues, I needed to understand more about the pregnant woman I'd seen him with. Laura advised caution, reminding me that the Millers likely had people watching me now that the divorce proceedings were underway. Nevertheless, I was determined to uncover the truth. Through careful research and some help from Laura's investigator, I identified the woman as Natalie Peterson, 29, a former employee at the Westfield Clinic. Her social media profiles showed she had worked there as a nurse, specializing in reproductive medicine for 3 years, before abruptly leaving the position around the time she began dating James. More disturbing was the connection I discovered between Natalie and Catherine Miller. They had served together on the board of a charity focused on genetic health research, and there were photos of them at several events dating back 5 years. This wasn't a random relationship. Natalie had been in the Millers' orbit long before she became involved with James. I needed more information about the Westfield Clinic itself. Laura's investigator discovered it was technically owned by a series of shell companies that ultimately led back to Miller Family Holdings. The clinic specialized in cutting-edge reproductive technologies, including experimental treatments not widely available elsewhere. With this knowledge, I took a calculated risk. Using a disguise and a fake name, I visited the Miller family estate under the pretense of being a caterer's assistant for one of Catherine's famous charity luncheons. The real catering staff was so busy that no one questioned my presence as I moved through the mansion's service areas. My goal was to find Catherine's secret room that Maria had mentioned. Following the housekeeper's directions, I made my way to the east wing of the house while the event was in full swing in the gardens. The door was locked, but I had come prepared with the small set of lockpicks I'd ordered online and practiced with obsessively for weeks. Inside, I found exactly what Maria had described and more. The walls were covered with family trees and genetic charts. A large table held medical files labeled with women's names, including my own. A computer displayed what looked like genetic sequencing data. Most disturbing was a whiteboard with a timeline of James's fertility attempts with different women, including notes about each miscarriage. As I was taking photos of everything with my phone, I heard voices approaching. I barely had time to hide in a closet before Catherine and James entered the room. Natalie's latest tests are promising, Catherine was saying. The genetic combination is exactly what we've been working toward. This child will secure the bloodline and your inheritance. And what about Rebecca? James asked, sounding troubled. The divorce is getting complicated. Her lawyer is more competent than we expected. She's nothing, Catherine dismissed. Once the paternity test proves the child is yours, the judge will see she deceived you about her fertility. No one will believe her wild accusations. But Mother, we both know she's not actually sterile. What if she can prove that? She can't, Catherine said confidently. We've altered her medical records, and Dr. Franklin knows better than to contradict us. Besides, all of her pregnancies failed. That's evidence enough. James sighed. Sometimes I wonder if we're doing the right thing. Rebecca really wanted children. Those miscarriages devastated her. Necessary sacrifices for the greater good, Catherine replied coldly. The Miller genetic line must be preserved without contamination. Her genetic compatibility was questionable at best. Natalie's profile is much more promising. The child will have superior intelligence, health, and longevity. They continued discussing me as if I were a failed breeding experiment, rather than a human being who had loved James and mourned our lost children. I remained frozen in the closet, recording their conversation on my phone and fighting the urge to burst out and confront them. After they left, I escaped the estate with my evidence and immediately shared everything with Laura. She was horrified but cautious. This is disturbing, but much of it was obtained illegally, she warned. We can't use the recordings or photos directly in court. We need to find legal ways to obtain the same information. That's when we decided to focus on the financial angle. Laura brought in David Chen, a financial forensic expert who specialized in uncovering hidden assets in divorce cases. David discovered that James had been funneling millions into research at the Westfield Clinic, specifically a project called Genetic Legacy Enhancement. Further investigation revealed the Millers had been funding controversial research into selective genetic manipulation for over a decade. They weren't just trying to have a child. They were attempting to create what Catherine considered the perfect heir, with carefully selected genetic traits. The pieces were falling into place. My miscarriages hadn't been natural at all. Based on the timeline I'd seen and the conversation I'd overheard, I suspected James or someone working for him had deliberately sabotaged my pregnancies when genetic testing showed the fetuses didn't meet Catherine's standards. This theory was strengthened when we located a research assistant who had left the Westfield Clinic after ethical concerns. She confirmed that the clinic had been conducting genetic testing on embryos and fetuses without proper consent, and that the Millers were particularly interested in certain genetic markers related to intelligence and longevity. They were playing God, the assistant told us, deciding which pregnancies should continue based on genetic profiles. It was eugenics disguised as family planning. The most chilling revelation came when we discovered that Natalie Peterson wasn't just carrying James's child. She had undergone extensive genetic testing and manipulation to ensure the pregnancy produced exactly the kind of heir Catherine wanted. Natalie hadn't randomly caught James's eye. She had been selected and groomed for this role. As we built our case, James became increasingly erratic. He called me late one night, clearly drunk. "You need to stop digging," he slurred. "You don't know what you're getting into, my mother. She's not someone you want as an enemy." "Did you cause my miscarriages, James?" I asked directly. There was a long pause. "It wasn't personal," he finally said. "It was business. Family business. The tests showed incompatibilities." "Incompatibilities?" I repeated, stunned by his admission. "Genetic markers Mother didn't approve of. She said our children wouldn't meet the Miller standard. I tried to argue for the first one, but after the genetic report, he trailed off, and I felt physically ill. So you deliberately terminated my pregnancies? Our children? They were flawed," he said, as if that explained everything. "Just drop the case, Rebecca. Take the settlement. You can't win against us." I hung up and vomited until there was nothing left. Then I called Laura and told her we needed to go public with everything we had. Legal consequences be damned. It wasn't just about my divorce anymore. It was about exposing a family that believed they had the right to play God with people's lives. The first day of our divorce proceedings dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the darkness of the case about to unfold. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and what I assumed were Miller family associates, judging by their expensive suits and hostile glares. James arrived, flanked by his legal team, led by Richard Walsh, one of the most expensive divorce attorneys in the country. James looked polished and confident in a tailored navy suit, offering sympathetic smiles to the court staff, as if he were the victim in all this. I wore a simple gray dress I'd bought at a department store, sitting beside Laura, who had prepared for this case like it was the battle of her career. Which, in many ways, it was. Going against the Miller family could make or break her practice. The media had already been primed with James's version of events. Local news had run stories about the tragic case of James Miller, whose wife had deceived him about her ability to have children. Some outlets even speculated that my nursing background had allowed me to fake medical records. The court of public opinion was firmly on James's side before proceedings even began. Catherine Miller sat in the front row behind her son, impeccably dressed in Chanel, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. Her presence was intimidating, and I noticed how the bailiff and even the court clerk seemed to treat her with deference. Judge Eleanor Harmon, however, appeared unmoved by the Miller influence. A veteran family court judge with a reputation for fairness, she called the court to order and set out the ground rules for the proceedings with brisk efficiency. Walsh opened with a devastating portrait of me as a calculating gold digger who had researched the Miller family's desire for an heir and deliberately concealed my sterility to marry into wealth. He presented a timeline of our marriage focusing exclusively on my miscarriages and subsequent emotional manipulation of James. "Your Honor," Walsh concluded his opening statement, "Mr. Miller entered this marriage in good faith, wanting nothing more than to build a family with a woman he loved. Miss Thompson, knowing she could never provide that family, deliberately deceived him, wasting years of his life in a fraudulent union." Laura's opening statement was more measured. She simply stated that we would present evidence showing I was not sterile, had never claimed to be fertile before marriage, and that James had entered the marriage with his own undisclosed fertility issues. She also hinted at disturbing evidence of medical interference that would be revealed during the trial. Walsh called his first witness, Dr. Gregory Phillips, who claimed to have reviewed my medical records and concluded I had a condition that made carrying a pregnancy to term virtually impossible. Under Laura's cross-examination, however, Dr. Phillips admitted he had never actually examined me and was basing his assessment solely on selected records provided by James's team. Next came a parade of witnesses who described my obsession with the Miller fortune and my unstable behavior after each miscarriage. Former household staff testified that I had thrown fits, broken things, and accused James of sabotaging my pregnancies, making me sound paranoid and unhinged. What Walsh didn't know was that Laura had anticipated this strategy. When it was our turn to cross-examine, she methodically exposed how each witness had received financial benefits from the Miller family, from paid college tuition for their children to suspicious consulting fees. The real blow came when James took the stand. Handsome and articulate, he played the role of the heartbroken husband perfectly, describing how he'd supported me through each miscarriage, only to discover I had known all along that I couldn't have children. "I just want to move on with my life and have the family I've always dreamed of," he told the court, his voice breaking appropriately. "Rebecca denied me that chance through deliberate deception." Laura's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Miller, when were you diagnosed with oligospermia and asthenozoospermia?" James's face blanched. "I don't know what you're talking about." Laura approached with a document. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence medical records from Boston Fertility Associates dated the 15th of June, 2015, showing Mr. Miller was diagnosed with low sperm count and poor motility, conditions that significantly impact male fertility. This was 2 years before he met my client." Walsh objected vehemently, claiming the records were obtained illegally, but Judge Harmon overruled him after Laura demonstrated they had been subpoenaed through proper channels. Laura continued. Mr. Miller, did you disclose this diagnosis to my client before or during your marriage? Those records are outdated, James deflected. I received treatment. Yes, you did, Laura agreed. Treatment that had limited success according to follow-up testing. Yet you allowed my client to believe her miscarriages were solely due to her fertility issues. In fact, you've built your entire divorce case on claiming she's sterile, while knowing your own fertility problems likely contributed to the pregnancy losses. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. I watched as Catherine Miller's expression darkened, her fingers gripping her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. By the end of James's testimony, cracks were showing in his perfect facade. He became defensive, contradicted himself several times, and showed flashes of the temper I knew all too well. The most dramatic moment came when Laura called a surprise witness, Nurse Jennifer Collins from the Westfield Clinic. Jennifer had information about the genetic testing performed on my pregnancies without my knowledge. However, before she could testify, Walsh successfully argued that she had signed confidentiality agreements with the clinic and that the information was protected by medical privacy laws. It was a significant setback. Judge Harmon reluctantly agreed that Nurse Collins couldn't testify about specific patients, though she could speak generally about the clinic's practices. This sanitized testimony was far less impactful than what we'd hoped for. By the end of the first day, things looked bleak. While Laura had managed to raise doubts about James's fertility, we hadn't been able to present our strongest evidence about the deliberate termination of my pregnancies or Catherine's eugenics obsession. I returned to my apartment, feeling defeated. The Millers' legal team had successfully blocked our most compelling witness, and their resources seemed limitless compared to ours. I sat on my small balcony, wondering if I should take the settlement offer and try to rebuild my life away from the Millers' influence. Around midnight, there was a knock at my door. Cautious after James's threatening call, I checked the peephole but saw no one. When I opened the door slightly, chain still engaged, I found a manila envelope on the floor with my name typed on the front. Inside was a USB drive and a note that read simply, "For court tomorrow. Jay sends this with regret." I spent the night reviewing the contents with Laura over a secure video call. By morning, we had a new strategy that would change everything. I know this has been an intense journey, and it's about to get even more shocking. If you're finding this story helpful or eye-opening, please take a second to like this video. Your support helps people like me find the courage to share these difficult truths about family betrayal. Now, let's get back to what happened when we returned to court with this mysterious evidence. The USB drive contained documents that would transform our case. Complete fertility records for both James and me, showing my normal reproductive health and his ongoing issues. Financial transfers to doctors who had treated me during my pregnancies, and most damning of all, email exchanges between Catherine and the Westfield Clinic discussing genetic testing on my specimens without my knowledge or consent. Laura spent the night consulting with colleagues about the legality of using evidence potentially obtained through unauthorized means. By morning, she had a strategy. "We won't introduce the actual documents directly," she explained. "Instead, we'll use the information to guide our questioning and force them to produce the records themselves through official channels." As we entered the courtroom for day 2, I noticed James looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes. Catherine sat rigidly beside him, whispering intensely in his ear. Something had shifted in their relationship. Laura began by requesting the court order the Westfield Clinic to produce all records related to genetic testing performed on samples from my pregnancies. Walsh objected immediately. "Your Honor, this is a fishing expedition. There's no evidence such testing ever occurred, and patient privacy laws protect any medical procedures that may have been performed." Judge Harmon looked thoughtful. "Miss Adams, what is the basis for this specific request?" "Your Honor, we have reason to believe Mr. Miller authorized genetic testing on fetal tissue from Miss Thompson's miscarriages without her knowledge or consent." These tests were performed as part of a family eugenics program overseen by Catherine Miller. The results of these tests allegedly led to deliberate termination of viable pregnancies that didn't meet the Millers' genetic standards. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Catherine's face contorted with rage, while James seemed to shrink in his seat. "That's an outrageous accusation," Walsh sputtered. "Completely unfounded." "If it's unfounded," Laura countered calmly, "then producing the records will quickly disprove our claim." Judge Harmon considered this. "I'm inclined to grant the request. The allegations are serious enough to warrant investigation." Walsh huddled with his team and then approached the bench for a private conference with the judge and Laura. After several tense minutes, they returned to their positions. In light of new information, Judge Harmon announced, "Mr. Miller has agreed to voluntarily submit to DNA testing to establish his fertility status. Additionally, the court will subpoena all medical records from the Westfield Clinic relating to both parties. We'll recess until tomorrow to allow for these procedures." It was a significant victory, but I knew the Millers would use the delay to strategize. They might even attempt to alter records overnight. Laura had anticipated this and had already filed emergency motions to secure the original documents and servers at the clinic. That evening, I noticed a black SUV parked across from my apartment. When I mentioned it to Laura over the phone, she insisted I stay with a friend instead. "They're getting desperate," she warned. "That makes them dangerous." I packed a small bag and was about to leave when my phone rang with an unknown number. "Rebecca." It was James's voice, sounding strained. "We need to talk." "My lawyer advised against speaking to you directly," I replied cautiously. "I know. Mine too. But I'm offering you $10 million to drop this case and walk away. Right now. Tonight." The sum was staggering. Financial security for life. Freedom from this nightmare. "Why would you offer that if you're innocent?" I asked. There was a long pause. "Because some things shouldn't come to light. For everyone's sake." "You mean for your mother's sake?" I corrected. "How many women has she done this to, James? How many pregnancies has she terminated because they didn't meet her genetic standards?" "You don't understand the pressure I've been under my entire life," he said, his voice breaking. "The Miller legacy, the perfect heir. It's all I've ever heard." "That doesn't excuse what you did to me," I said firmly. "To us, our babies." "I know," he whispered. "That's why I sent you the drive." The admission stunned me. "You sent it?" "Rebecca, my mother is dangerous when cornered. Please, take the money and disappear. Start fresh somewhere she can't find you." I ended the call without agreeing to his offer. His warning about Catherine was troubling, but I couldn't walk away, not when we were so close to exposing the truth. The next morning, Laura arrived with news that the Westfield Clinic had suffered a mysterious server fire overnight, potentially destroying electronic records. However, our emergency motion had resulted in court officers securing physical files and backup drives before the incident. Additionally, several clinic employees, fearing legal repercussions, had come forward with information. Back in court, the atmosphere was electric. James's DNA test had been expedited, and the results were already available. Additionally, a former director of the Westfield Clinic, Dr. Thomas Thompson, no relation to me, had agreed to testify about the Miller family's influence over the facility's practices. Walsh tried desperately to block Dr. Thompson's testimony, citing doctor-patient privilege, but Judge Harmon ruled that he could testify about general practices without naming specific patients. Dr. Thompson's testimony was devastating. He described a research program funded entirely by the Miller family, focused on identifying superior genetic markers and ensuring only embryos with these markers survived to term. While he carefully avoided stating directly that my pregnancies had been terminated, he confirmed that the clinic had protocols for addressing non-compliant genetic profiles in early pregnancies, particularly for VIP clients. When asked who qualified as VIP clients, Dr. Thompson looked directly at Catherine Miller, those whose family names appear on the building's donor plaque. Walsh's cross-examination attempted to paint Dr. Thompson as a disgruntled former employee with a vendetta, but the doctor remained composed and professional, backing up his statements with documented clinic protocols. Next came the DNA test results. The court-appointed medical expert confirmed that James had significant fertility issues that made natural conception difficult, though not impossible. More importantly, the test revealed genetic markers for conditions Catherine allegedly considered undesirable in the Miller bloodline, including a predisposition to early-onset heart disease. In my professional opinion, the expert testified, Mr. Miller's fertility issues likely contributed significantly to the pregnancy difficulties described in this case. Miss Thompson's reproductive system shows no abnormalities that would prevent carrying a pregnancy to term. The most powerful testimony came from Dr. Sarah Johnson, who had worked directly with me during my second and third pregnancies. Though she had initially refused to get involved, the mounting evidence of unethical practices had changed her mind. Miss Thompson's pregnancies were progressing normally under my care, Dr. Johnson stated firmly. However, after each ultrasound, I was instructed to send genetic material for testing, authorized by forms allegedly signed by Miss Thompson. I later discovered these signatures were forged. What happened after the testing? Laura asked. I was removed from her case each time. When I inquired later, I was told Miss Thompson had miscarried naturally. Given what I know now about clinic practices, I have serious doubts about whether those miscarriages were indeed natural. As Dr. Johnson spoke, I saw Catherine Miller rise from her seat and stride toward the exit. Judge Harmon ordered her to remain, but Catherine ignored the command. Before the bailiff could intervene, she turned to face the courtroom. "You pathetic people with your ordinary genes and limited vision," she spat. "The Miller bloodline is destined for greatness, not to be diluted by inferior stock. Every decision I made was to protect our genetic legacy. James knows his duty to the family." With that shocking outburst, she swept from the courtroom, leaving stunned silence in her wake. James sat with his head in his hands, visibly distancing himself from his mother's eugenic proclamation. Laura used the moment masterfully. "Your Honor, I believe Mrs. Miller's statement speaks for itself regarding the family's attitudes and practices. We request the court consider it as an admission against interest." Judge Harmon nodded gravely. "So noted." Before adjourning for the day, the judge addressed James directly. "Mr. Miller, given the evidence presented and your mother's concerning statements, I'm ordering a full investigation into the practices at the Westfield Clinic as they relate to Miss Thompson's miscarriages. Additionally, I'm requiring you to provide documentation of any and all genetic testing performed without Miss Thompson's knowledge." James conferred briefly with Walsh, then stood. "Your Honor, I'm prepared to provide those documents immediately and cooperate fully with the investigation." It was the first crack in the Miller family's unified defense. As we left the courtroom, I caught James watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Regret? Fear? Perhaps both. That night, Laura called with news that would change everything. "Catherine has fled the country on the family's private jet," she reported, "and someone from James's team reached out. He wants to settle, but not in the way you might expect. He's offering to testify about everything in exchange for certain considerations." "What kind of considerations?" I asked. "Immunity from prosecution for his role in the clinic's practices, and protection from his mother, Rebecca. He's afraid of her. Really afraid. And based on what he's willing to testify about, he should be." The pieces were falling into place. Now we just needed the judge to open that final envelope. The morning after Catherine's dramatic courtroom exit and subsequent flight from the country, I received a call from an unknown number. "My name is Jessica Miller," the woman said when I answered. "I'm James's sister. You've probably never heard of me." She was right. In 6 years of marriage, James had never mentioned having a sister. According to him, he was an only child, the sole heir to the Miller fortune. "The family disowned me 15 years ago," Jessica explained, sensing my confusion. "I refused to participate in Mother's breeding program. I thought I was the only one who escaped until I saw the news about your case." We arranged to meet at Laura's office for safety. Jessica arrived wearing large sunglasses and a scarf covering her hair, clearly concerned about being recognized. Once inside, she removed her disguise, revealing a woman in her early 40s with the same blue eyes as James, though hers held a wariness that came from years of looking over her shoulder. Catherine isn't just obsessed with genetic purity, Jessica explained. She believes the Miller bloodline contains special qualities that elevate us above ordinary humans. It's a delusion passed down through generations, but she took it to extremes with modern technology. According to Jessica, Catherine had subjected all her children to rigorous genetic testing and enhancement procedures throughout their childhoods. Those who didn't meet her standards or rebelled against her control were removed from the family. There were originally 4 of us siblings, Jessica revealed, her voice breaking. James was the only one who fully complied with Mother's demands. My brother Thomas supposedly committed suicide after his wife had 3 miscarriages, but I've always suspected Mother's involvement. My youngest brother Michael was disowned for marrying a woman Catherine deemed genetically inferior because she had a family history of diabetes. Jessica herself had been cut off after refusing an arranged marriage to a man Catherine had selected for his genetic profile. The official story was that I had a mental breakdown and was institutionalized. In reality, I changed my name and moved across the country. I've been watching the family from afar ever since, gathering evidence of their activities. She had brought documents dating back decades. Catherine's journals outlining her eugenic philosophies, medical records of family members who had been subjected to unauthorized procedures, and correspondence with doctors willing to participate in ethically questionable practices. Most disturbing were records of multiple pregnancies across the extended Miller family that had been terminated after genetic testing showed undesirable traits. Jessica believed her brother, Thomas's wife, had been subjected to the same treatment I experienced. James isn't entirely innocent, Jessica acknowledged, but he's also a victim of lifelong indoctrination and psychological abuse. Catherine convinced him that preserving the Miller genetic legacy was his sacred duty, more important than individual happiness or ethical considerations. Laura was cautious about Jessica's sudden appearance, but recognized the value of her testimony and evidence. "Are you willing to testify in court?" she asked. Jessica nodded. "That's why I've come forward now. When I saw the news about Catherine fleeing the country, I knew this might be our only chance to expose what she's done. I just need assurances about my safety." With Jessica's cooperation secured, other allies began to emerge. Michael Miller and his wife Elena contacted Laura the next day, offering their own accounts of Catherine's obsession with genetic purity and the lengths she went to ensure the family bloodline remained uncontaminated. The most surprising ally came in the form of Megan Thomas, James's former assistant and mistress. After seeing the news coverage of the trial, she reached out with crucial information. "I was never romantically involved with James," Megan confessed when we met. "Catherine hired me to pretend to be his mistress. She wanted you to file for divorce so James could claim you were the one who abandoned the marriage. When that didn't happen, they switched to Plan B, claiming you concealed sterility." Megan provided emails from Catherine outlining the scheme, as well as recordings of conversations where they discussed how to manipulate me into leaving. "I didn't know about the pregnancies," she said, visibly upset. "I thought it was just a wealthy family's divorce drama until I saw Dr. Johnson's testimony. What they did to you was monstrous." With each new ally, our case grew stronger. The former director of the Westfield Clinic, Dr. Thompson, agreed to provide comprehensive documentation of the facility's unethical practices under Miller family influence. He revealed that Catherine had funded a separate research wing dedicated to experimental reproductive technologies, with the goal of creating genetically superior children. The staff called it the dollhouse, because that's how Catherine viewed these pregnancies, Dr. Thompson explained. Like designing perfect dolls with customized features. Anyone who raised ethical concerns was immediately terminated and blacklisted in the medical community. In a pivotal development, Laura managed to locate and connect with James's estranged brother Michael and his wife Elena. They had been living under different names in a small town on the opposite coast, deliberately staying below the radar to avoid Catherine's influence. Michael's story mirrored my own in disturbing ways. His wife Elena had experienced multiple miscarriages while they were still in the family's orbit, each occurring after genetic testing. When they discovered Elena was pregnant again, they kept it secret and fled before Catherine could intervene. Their daughter, now 14, was healthy and thriving despite having the genetic marker for diabetes that Catherine had deemed unacceptable. Mother doesn't see people, she sees genetic codes, Michael explained during our meeting. She believes imperfections can and should be engineered out of existence, starting with the Miller line. It's not just about health conditions. She selects for intelligence, physical attributes, even personality traits she considers superior. Elena added. When we left, Catherine told Michael he was betraying centuries of careful breeding by allowing defective genes into the family. She said our child would be a stain on the Miller legacy. That's when we knew we had to disappear completely. Michael provided documentation of the trust fund that had been contingent on James producing a suitable heir before his 40th birthday. The definition of suitable included specific genetic criteria that would be evaluated after birth. If the child didn't meet these criteria, the inheritance would still be forfeit. That's why they were so desperate for the perfect pregnancy, Michael explained. James stands to lose over $100 million if he doesn't produce an heir with the right genetic profile by his birthday next month. This information cast James's relationship with Natalie Peterson in a new light. Our financial expert David Chen discovered that Natalie had received over $500,000 in consulting fees from Miller Family Holdings in the past year. Her pregnancy wasn't just convenient timing. It was a contracted arrangement. Armed with this growing mountain of evidence, Laura prepared for what we hoped would be the final day in court. The night before, I received another call from James. "Rebecca," he began hesitantly, "I want you to know I've agreed to testify against my mother tomorrow." "Why the change of heart?" I asked, not bothering to hide my skepticism. "Meeting my siblings again after all these years," he replied. "Seeing what mother's obsession has done to all of us, and—" He paused, finding out what really happened to Thomas. "What do you mean?" Jessica had it right. His death wasn't suicide. Mother had his fertility treatments tampered with after genetic testing showed his child would have a high risk of hereditary heart disease. When his wife lost their third pregnancy and he threatened to expose everything, Mother arranged an accident. "I found the proof in her private files before she fled." His voice broke. "I've been complicit in horrible things, Rebecca. Things I can't undo. But I can tell the truth now, for whatever that's worth. I didn't offer forgiveness or understanding. Those feelings might come later, or they might not. But I did recognize the courage it took for him to break free from his mother's control after a lifetime of manipulation. "I'll see you in court," was all I said before hanging up. That night, I barely slept, thinking about all the lives Catherine Miller had damaged or destroyed in pursuit of her twisted genetic vision. My lost pregnancies, Thomas's death, Jessica and Michael's years in hiding. Even James, molded from childhood to value bloodline over basic humanity. Tomorrow would bring either justice or further heartbreak. Either way, I was no longer facing it alone. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity on what would become the final day of proceedings. News of Catherine Miller's flight from justice and rumors of James's planned testimony had turned our divorce case into a media sensation. Every seat was filled, with reporters lining the walls and a crowd gathered outside the courthouse. James arrived looking nothing like the polished, confident man who had started these proceedings. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, his hair was unkempt, and the dark circles under his eyes had deepened. Richard Walsh, his high-powered attorney, seemed equally disheveled, clutching his briefcase with white knuckles. Most striking was the physical distance between them as they entered. No more huddled conferences or reassuring shoulder pats. It was clear their legal relationship had fractured along with James's loyalty to his mother. Judge Harmon called the court to order with a stern warning about the gravity of the day's testimony. "This case has expanded well beyond a simple divorce proceeding," she noted. "Evidence of potentially criminal activity has emerged, and I remind all witnesses that they are under oath and subject to penalties for perjury." Laura called Jessica Miller as our first witness. There was an audible gasp when she was introduced as James's sister, followed by furious scribbling from reporters. Jessica told her story with quiet dignity, describing Catherine's eugenic obsession and the family's dark history of reproductive manipulation. My mother believes the Miller bloodline contains genetic markers for exceptional intelligence and longevity, Jessica explained. She's dedicated her life to purifying these traits through what amounts to a breeding program disguised as family planning. Those who don't comply are eliminated from the family, one way or another. Walsh's cross-examination attempted to paint Jessica as a disgruntled family member with a vendetta, but her testimony remained consistent and compelling. When he pressed her about why she'd waited so long to come forward, her answer silenced the courtroom. "Fear," she said simply. "Not just fear for myself, but for others who might suffer if I failed." Catherine Miller has connections throughout the medical establishment, the legal system, and local government. She's ruined people who've crossed her. But watching Rebecca fight despite everything the family threw at her gave me courage I haven't had in 15 years. Michael and Elena Miller testified next, corroborating Jessica's accounts and adding details about their own experiences with Catherine's genetic fixation. Their testimony included documentation of trust fund stipulations requiring genetic testing of all Miller heirs, with inheritance contingent on meeting specific criteria. Dr. Thompson provided the medical context for these personal accounts, explaining how the Westfield Clinic had become essentially a private laboratory for Catherine's eugenics experiments. His detailed breakdown of clinic protocols specifically designed for Miller family members left no doubt about the systematic nature of the manipulation. "In my 30 years of reproductive medicine," he concluded, "I've never seen anything approaching this level of calculated interference with natural pregnancy. What happened to Miss Thompson and others was not treatment. It was experimentation without consent." The most dramatic moment came when James himself took the stand. Walsh tried to prevent his testimony, citing attorney-client privilege, but James had waived this protection. He approached the witness box slowly, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the courtroom until he finally looked directly at me. "Everything they've said is true," he began quietly. "My mother orchestrated a decades-long program to control the Miller genetic line. I was raised to believe this was our family's special purpose, our contribution to human advancement. Any questioning of her methods was treated as betrayal of our legacy." James described how Catherine had selected potential partners for him based on genetic compatibility, how she had arranged for monitoring and testing of all pregnancies, and how she had ordered termination of those that didn't meet her criteria, including all 3 of mine. "I knew what was happening," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I told myself it was necessary sacrifice for a greater purpose. The pregnancies that were terminated were flawed, according to Mother's standards. They showed markers for conditions she considered unacceptable in the Miller line." "Did Rebecca know about any of this?" Laura asked. "No. She was told they were natural miscarriages. She blamed herself, which Mother said was convenient for maintaining the program. When Rebecca began asking too many questions after the 3rd loss, Mother decided she had to be removed and replaced with someone more compliant." Walsh, looking increasingly defeated, attempted minimal cross-examination, but James's testimony was devastatingly straightforward. He provided dates, names, and specific details that aligned perfectly with the evidence we'd gathered. His final revelation stunned even those of us who thought we understood the full scope of Catherine's schemes. James produced a memory drive containing security footage from the Miller estate, showing Catherine discussing the removal of his brother Thomas after he threatened to expose the family's practices. "Thomas didn't commit suicide," James stated flatly. "Mother arranged for his fertility medication to be tampered with, causing his wife's 3rd miscarriage. When he discovered what she'd done and threatened to go public, she ordered what she called permanent retirement. The accident that killed him was carefully orchestrated. Judge Harmon immediately called a recess and ordered the footage sealed for review by law enforcement. When court resumed an hour later, the atmosphere had shifted from sensational to somber as the full criminal implications of Catherine's actions became clear. During the break, James had made a decision that changed everything. Through Walsh, He offered a complete confession and full cooperation with authorities in exchange for consideration in sentencing. He also agreed to a divorce settlement that gave me half of his personal fortune, not just the marital assets. Most importantly, he volunteered to submit to a comprehensive DNA test to definitively resolve the fertility question at the heart of the original divorce filing. When the results were presented to the court, they confirmed what we already knew. James had significant fertility issues that likely contributed to our pregnancy difficulties. There was no evidence whatsoever of any fertility problems on my part, but the DNA testing revealed something else. Something that explained Catherine's fanatical obsession with the Miller genetic line. James, Jessica, Michael, and their late brother Thomas all carried a rare genetic marker associated with exceptional cognitive processing and cellular regeneration. This marker was the foundation of Catherine's belief in Miller's superiority, the trait she was desperate to isolate and enhance through her breeding program. Your Honor, Laura addressed the court. In light of Mr. Miller's confession and the DNA evidence, we ask that you dismiss his divorce petition alleging fraudulent misrepresentation. Additionally, we request that you consider the extensive evidence of criminal activity in your final ruling. Judge Harmon nodded gravely. This court has heard testimony and seen evidence of deeply disturbing practices carried out by the Miller family under Catherine Miller's direction. While much of this goes beyond the scope of a divorce proceeding, it cannot be ignored in rendering a fair judgment. She turned to James. Mr. Miller, your petition for divorce on grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation is not just denied, it is found to be deliberately false and malicious. You have admitted under oath to knowing Miss Thompson was not sterile, yet you built an entire legal case around this falsehood. The judge then reached for a sealed envelope on her bench. Before announcing my final ruling, there is one more piece of evidence to consider. Miss Thompson provided this sealed envelope at the beginning of these proceedings, requesting it be opened only at this stage. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harmon broke the seal and examined the contents. Her expression remained impassive, but I saw her hands tighten slightly around the documents. Mr. Miller, she said finally, looking directly at James, would you care to explain these paternity test results? The paternity test results in the envelope revealed what Catherine Miller had worked so desperately to hide. James was already a father. Twice over. The documents showed conclusively that James had fathered 2 children years before our marriage, both with women who had worked at Miller companies. Both pregnancies had progressed normally until genetic testing was performed, after which the women had suffered unexplained pregnancy losses. Medical records indicated these losses occurred under suspicious circumstances, similar to my own miscarriages. Most damning was evidence that Catherine had known about these pregnancies and had them terminated against the mother's knowledge or consent when genetic testing showed markers she deemed unacceptable. The DNA profiles had been preserved in the Westfield Clinic's database, labeled simply as Miller rejected specimens. James stared at the results in stunned silence. This was information even he hadn't known. I obtained these through a former lab technician who kept records of everything for her own protection, I explained to the court. Catherine didn't just manipulate my pregnancies. She's been doing this for years, eliminating any Miller pregnancy that didn't meet her genetic standards, even without James's knowledge. Judge Harmon's expression hardened as she reviewed the documentation. These allegations go far beyond the scope of family court and constitute serious criminal conduct. I am referring this evidence to the district attorney's office for immediate investigation. Her final ruling was comprehensive and unequivocal. She granted our divorce on grounds of James's cruelty and fraudulent behavior, awarding me half of his personal fortune as he had agreed, plus additional punitive damages to be determined. She also granted me sole ownership of the Miller family estate, noting that Catherine had forfeited any claim to the property by fleeing the country to avoid legal consequences. Finally, Judge Harmon concluded, I am ordering a complete investigation into all practices at the Westfield Clinic and freezing all Miller family assets pending criminal proceedings. Mr. Miller, while your cooperation is noted, you remain implicated in serious wrongdoing. You will surrender your passport and remain available to authorities as they pursue these matters. As the gavel fell, signaling the end of proceedings, a weight lifted from my shoulders. After months of fighting against seemingly insurmountable odds, justice had prevailed. The truth about Catherine's eugenic program was exposed, and the Miller family's reign of reproductive terror was over. The media coverage was immediate and extensive. Headlines declared it the eugenics divorce and Miller family breeding program exposed. Medical ethicists, legal experts, and genetic counselors debated the implications on every news channel. My story became a lightning rod for discussions about reproductive rights, medical consent, and the dangers of genetic determinism. In the weeks that followed, more women came forward with similar stories of unexplained pregnancy losses after involvement with the Miller family. The district attorney formed a special task force to investigate all allegations, and federal authorities became involved when evidence suggested Catherine's program had crossed state lines. I established the Reproductive Justice Foundation using a portion of my settlement, providing support for victims of fertility fraud and reproductive coercion. The foundation also funded research into ethical applications of genetic medicine and advocated for stronger legal protections around reproductive technologies. The Miller family estate, once a monument to Catherine's eugenic vision, was transformed into the headquarters for the foundation and a treatment center for women recovering from reproductive trauma. The wing that had housed Catherine's secret research was converted into a public education center about the history and dangers of eugenics movements. Catherine remained a fugitive, reportedly moving between countries without extradition treaties with the United States. Occasionally, reports would surface of her seeking cutting-edge genetic treatments in obscure clinics around the world, still pursuing her obsession with genetic perfection despite everything. James cooperated fully with authorities, providing detailed testimony about his mother's activities over decades. His plea agreement resulted in house arrest rather than prison time, with the requirement that he undergo extensive psychological treatment to address the lifelong manipulation he had experienced. While I couldn't forgive what he had done, I recognized that he too had been a victim of his mother's twisted ideology, albeit one who had made terrible choices as an adult. Natalie Peterson's pregnancy was indeed carrying James's child, conceived through IVF with genetic screening to ensure it met Catherine's criteria. After learning the truth about the Miller family's practices, she chose to cooperate with investigators and sought independent medical care to ensure her pregnancy remained free from Catherine's influence. The baby, a boy, was born healthy, despite lacking several markers Catherine had deemed essential, further disproving her theories about Miller genetic superiority. Jessica and Michael Miller both reclaimed their family names and became advocates for those affected by Catherine's eugenic program. With the family fortune mostly frozen pending legal proceedings, they focused on healing the damage their mother had caused rather than preserving wealth or status. 1 year after the divorce was finalized, I officially adopted a 5-year-old girl named Maya, who had been in the foster system since birth. She had a minor heart condition that would have made her an automatic rejection under Catherine's criteria, but that just made me love her more fiercely. Her resilience and joy despite early challenges inspired me daily. On a crisp autumn morning, as Maya and I planted tulip bulbs in what had once been Catherine's precisely manicured garden, a letter arrived from the psychiatric facility where James was receiving treatment. I set it aside initially, unsure if I wanted to reopen that chapter of my life. But later, after Maya was asleep, curiosity won out. The letter wasn't asking for forgiveness or reconciliation. Instead, it was a detailed account of James's progress in therapy, his growing understanding of how thoroughly Catherine had warped his perspective on family and genetics, and his commitment to making whatever amends were possible for the harm he had participated in. "I don't expect you to ever forgive me," he wrote toward the end. "What happened to you, to our children, was unforgivable. But I want you to know that your courage in fighting for truth has freed not just yourself, but generations of Millers to come from my mother's twisted vision. The cycle of manipulation and control that has defined my family for decades has ended because you refused to be silenced. I didn't respond to the letter. Perhaps someday I would, when the wounds weren't quite so raw. For now, it was enough to know that Catherine's legacy of genetic determinism was crumbling, replaced by a more compassionate understanding of what really makes a family. The envelope James's mother had been so desperate to suppress had contained more than just paternity test results. It held the truth that had shattered her entire worldview, that human worth couldn't be reduced to genetic markers, that her vision of perfection was a dangerous delusion, and that the real legacy worth preserving wasn't genetic at all, but ethical. As I looked at Maya sleeping peacefully in her bedroom, that was once part of Catherine's sterile empire, I knew I had found something Catherine never understood, despite all her obsession with family legacy. Love that transcended biology, that didn't demand genetic perfection, that accepted and celebrated human variation in all its forms. That was the true justice in the end. Not just legal victories or financial settlements, but the freedom to define family on our own terms, based on love rather than DNA. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult story. If anything in my experience resonated with you or helped you recognize patterns in your own life, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Your support means everything to those of us who share these painful truths. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about times when family betrayal led to unexpected strength, or how you've redefined family beyond biological connections. Every story shared helps someone else feel less alone in their journey. Remember, sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones we choose or build from the ashes of betrayal. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.